Marcus Williams stood in his field as the patrol ship landed, kicking up dust that settled on his crops. At 90 years old, he was one of the last human farmers on Epsilon 6, his dark skin weathered by years under the alien sun. The familiar sound of the engines made his stomach tighten. They were back again. The ship's door slid open with a hiss. 3 colonial security officers stepped out, led by Officer Brandt. His pale blue uniform was always perfectly pressed, unlike the other officers who didn't bother. That made him more dangerous, not less. Men who cared about appearances cared what others thought. "Inspection time, old man," Brandt called out, his voice carrying across the field. He deliberately stepped on a row of newly planted seedlings, crushing them under his boot. Marcus said nothing. He'd survived worse than these weekly inspections that had started 8 months ago. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from holding back decades of rage that had no place to go. "Nothing to say today." Brandt walked closer, the other officers spreading out behind him. "Usually you at least pretend to be polite." Marcus looked at his crops, the blue-tinged corn hybrid he'd developed specifically for this soil, the sweet fruit vines climbing their supports. Feeding 200 families in the nearby settlement depended on this harvest. "Just do what you came to do," Marcus finally said, his voice low and steady. Brandt smiled. "Cooperation. I like that." He turned to the other officers. "Check the storage units and the water filtration system." Marcus watched as they moved through his farm with practiced efficiency. They knew where to look, where to cause the most damage while claiming it was part of their job. Last week, they'd broken his irrigation computer. The week before, they'd claimed his seed storage didn't meet regulations and destroyed 3 months of careful hybridization work. "Your quota is being adjusted," Brandt said, reading from his tablet. "Colony needs more resources for the new Western development." "That's the 3rd adjustment this season," Marcus replied. "Those numbers aren't possible with the land I have." "Not my problem." Brandt shrugged. "Maybe it's time to consider selling. StarCorp has made offers to all the independent farmers in this region. Generous offers, considering." Marcus knew what those offers were worth. The farmers who had sold were now working in the processing plants for barely enough to eat. Their land was being stripped of everything valuable, not farmed. "I'm not selling," Marcus said. "Then meet the quota." Brandt's face hardened. "Or we'll have to consider your farm a non-productive asset." One of the other officers emerged from Marcus's cabin, holding something. "Found this behind a panel." "Sir, looks like an illegal transmitter." Marcus's heart sank. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. Brandt took the small device, examining it with exaggerated care. "Unauthorized communication with off-world entities is restricted, Williams. You know that." "It's just a family radio," Marcus lied. "For emergencies." "This is military-grade tech." Brandt's smile turned predatory. "Who were you contacting? What were you sending?" Marcus stayed silent. "Take it apart," Brandt ordered the other officer, "and check for more." For the next hour, Marcus watched as they tore through his cabin, his equipment shed, evened. As the sun began to set, turning the sky, the deep purple that still felt alien even after 40 years on this world, the officers finally prepared to leave. "We'll be watching you closer now," Brandt said. "One more violation, and you'll lose everything." After their ship disappeared over the horizon, Marcus walked slowly back to his cabin. Inside, among the wreckage of his simple life, he carefully pulled out the one thing they hadn't found: a small holographic photo kept in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. The image showed a younger version of himself standing next to a tall, serious young man in a simple gray uniform, his son Elijah, on the day he left for the academy 15 years ago. Marcus touched the image gently, then whispered to it, "They'd gone too far this time, Elijah. It's time to come home." In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains as the nightly storms began. Marcus carefully replaced the photo and began cleaning up the mess the officers had left behind. Tomorrow would be another day of hard work. But for the first time in years, he felt something like hope. Across the galaxy, Elijah Williams sat alone in a dimly lit room aboard the Galactic Intelligence Service headquarters station. The secure terminal in front of him displayed footage that made his blood run cold. His father, Marcus Williams, being pushed around by colonial security officers on the farm where Elijah had grown up. Elijah's face revealed nothing as he watched. 15 years of training had taught him to hide his emotions, but his right hand, resting on the desk, had curled into a tight fist. The footage ended, and Elijah sat motionless for several minutes. Then he stood up, straightened his plain gray uniform, and walked to his commander's office. Commander Vega looked up as Elijah entered. "Agent Williams, something urgent." "Request emergency leave, sir. Family matter." Elijah's voice was calm and professional. Vega studied him carefully. In 7 years, Elijah had never asked for personal leave. "Your current assignment can be paused," Elijah finished. "I'll make up the time when I return." "Location: Epsilon 6. Vega's eyebrows rose slightly. "Colonial territory. There's been reports of unrest there. My father still lives there." After a long pause, Vega nodded. 3 weeks. Maintain cover protocols. No agency resources." Elijah turned to leave. "Williams," Vega called after him. "Whatever you're planning, be careful." 3 days later, a simple trader's ship approached Epsilon 6. From the cockpit, Elijah watched the blue-green planet grow larger. 15 years had passed since he'd left this world behind. The farm boy who had departed was now one of the most effective operatives in the service, specialized in deep infiltration and information gathering. The spaceport was busier than he remembered. New buildings dominated the skyline, all bearing the StarCorp logo. Colonial security officers patrolled in groups of 3, their hands resting on their weapons. Elijah moved through the crowds easily, just another trader in nondescript clothes. He rented a ground vehicle and headed toward the farming district, noting how the city gave way sharply to farmland with no gradual transition. New security checkpoints had been established, but his fake credentials passed inspection. As he drove, he saw abandoned farms, equipment left to rust, fields returning to the native purple grass of Epsilon 6. The remaining active farms had the StarCorp logo displayed prominently. His father's farm appeared on the horizon. The simple white structures looked smaller than he remembered, but the fields were still well maintained. Then he noticed the colonial security vehicle parked near the main building, the small shrine he kept for his late wife. They found nothing else because there was nothing to find. The message had already been sent. Elijah parked at a distance and approached on foot, moving silently through the tall crops. Voices became clearer as he neared the house. "Your water usage exceeded allocation again, Williams." The voice was cold, official. There was a leak in the system. His father's voice was familiar, yet somehow older, more tired. "That's your 3rd violation this month." Elijah crept closer until he could see them. 3 officers stood in a half circle around his father. The lead officer, his nameplate read Brandt, was holding a tablet while the other 2 stood with their hands on their weapons. "I fixed the leak," Marcus said calmly. After wasting colony resources, Brandt stepped closer to Marcus. "Maybe you're getting too old for this work." "I meet my quotas." "Barely." Brandt motioned to one of the other officers. "Check his storage units. I bet we'll find more violations." Elijah watched as the officer pushed past his father roughly, knocking the old man off balance. Marcus stumbled and fell to his knees. Instead of helping him up, Brandt laughed. "Look at you. Pathetic. StarCorp is being generous with their buyout offers. Take it before they change their minds." That was enough. Elijah stepped out from his hiding place and walked toward the group with measured steps. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. All heads turned toward him. The officers' hands moved to their weapons. "Who are you?" Brandt demanded. "Someone passing through." Elijah continued walking forward. "Someone who doesn't like seeing an old man treated this way." Brant laughed. Mind your own business, traitor, or you'll be joining him in a cell. Elijah was close enough now to help his father to his feet. Their eyes met for the first time in 15 years. Recognition, love, and warning all passed between them in that silent moment. You shouldn't have come, Marcus whispered. You shouldn't have waited so long to call. Elijah replied quietly. He turned to face Brant, who was reaching for his communicator. I'm going to need to see your identification, Brant said. Elijah smiled slightly. I don't think that will be necessary. The officer who had moved toward the storage units came back around the corner, weapon drawn. Sir, you need to see what's in. He never finished his sentence. Elijah moved with a speed that belonged to no ordinary trader, disarming the officer and knocking him unconscious in 2 fluid motions. The farm suddenly became very quiet. The remaining officers stared at their unconscious colleague, then back at Elijah. Their hands hovered near their weapons, but something in Elijah's stance made them hesitate. Who are you really? Brant demanded, his confidence wavering. Just a son visiting his father, Elijah replied calmly. I suggest you leave now. Brant looked from Elijah to Marcus, recognition slowly dawning. Williams, you're his son, the one who left for the core worlds. And now I'm back. Elijah took a step forward. We can discuss any legitimate inspection another day. The officers backed away, dragging their unconscious colleague. This isn't over, Brant called as they retreated to their vehicle. Not by a long shot. After the dust from their departing vehicle settled, Marcus and Elijah stood in silence, 15 years of separation stretching between them. You look well, Marcus finally said. Elijah nodded. So do you, all things considered. They moved inside the farmhouse. It was smaller than Elijah remembered, but still felt like home. The wooden table where he had eaten countless meals as a child still stood in the center of the main room, though the chairs around it were fewer now. You should not have confronted them like that, Marcus said, putting on a kettle for tea. They'll be back with more men. I know. We don't have much time. Elijah looked around. What's really happening here, Father? Why are they so determined to force you out? Marcus sighed deeply. He moved to the old storage cabinet and pulled out a metal box. Opening it, he removed several soil samples sealed in clear containers. Each sample glowed with a faint blue light. They want the farm because of what's beneath it, Marcus explained, placing the samples on the table. Stellarium, rare enough to power 1,000 ships. Elijah picked up one of the samples, examining the glowing soil. How long have you known? 3 years. Found it when digging the new irrigation system. Marcus sat down heavily. At first, I thought it was just a curiosity. Then I did some research. Why didn't you tell me? And pull you from your work. You were making a difference out there. Marcus shook his head. I handled it as long as I could. Elijah placed the sample back in the box. Is it just our farm? No, the entire Northern Valley. That's why StarCorp has been buying up farms. The ones who wouldn't sell started having accidents or facing harassment. Marcus looked out the window. I'm the last one left who hasn't sold. But why keep fighting alone? Why not expose them? I've tried. Marcus stood up and moved to a loose floorboard beneath the kitchen counter. He pried it up to reveal a hidden compartment. I've been collecting evidence. Recordings, soil tests, testimonies from farmers who sold under duress. Even traced money back to the governor's private accounts. He pulled out a data drive. I sent copies to 3 different planetary authorities. All were intercepted or ignored. Elijah took the drive. So you finally contacted me. As a last resort, Marcus looked at his son with weary eyes. I know what you really do, Elijah. Your mother and I always knew the academy was just a cover. Before Elijah could respond, a loud crash came from outside. They moved to the window to see colonial security vehicles surrounding the farm. More than before, at least 5 vehicles, with officers taking positions around the property. They figured out who you are, Marcus said calmly. He moved to a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. With practiced movements, he pressed several spots in sequence. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a cache of weapons that no simple farmer should possess. Pulse rifles, energy pistols, and even what appeared to be military-grade explosives were neatly arranged inside. "Seems I'm not the only one with secrets," Elijah said, surprised. Marcus handed his son a blaster. "Did you think your mother and I were just farmers before we settled here?" Elijah took the weapon, feeling its familiar weight. "You were operatives. Colonial Wars, Eastern Front. We were part of the resistance against corporate expansion." Marcus checked his own weapon with practiced ease. "We came here to start over, to build something instead of fighting. But some fights find you no matter how far you run." Outside, an amplified voice called out, "Marcus Williams, we know who's in there with you. Come out now, or we will use force." Father and son exchanged a look of understanding. "Like old times?" Elijah asked. "Not quite," Marcus replied, a hint of his old fire returning to his eyes. "This time, we're fighting for something that's ours." The officers outside expected an easy raid. Most farmers surrendered immediately when facing colonial security in force, but the Williams farm had suddenly gone quiet and dark. "Something's wrong," one of the junior officers said, shifting nervously. "They should have answered by now." Officer Brandt raised his communicator. "Williams, this is your final warning." The response came not in words but in action. The garden sprinklers around the farmhouse suddenly activated, but instead of water, they sprayed a thick cloud of smoke that quickly covered the area. "Masks on," Brandt shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a loud humming sound as the farm's perimeter fence began glowing with blue energy. From inside the farmhouse, Marcus and Elijah moved with coordinated precision. Years might have passed since they'd fought together, but some instincts never faded. "Eastern side is weakest," Marcus said, pointing to a display panel showing the farm's layout. Small dots representing the officers moved through the smoke. "They'll try to cut the power to the fence first." Elijah nodded. "I'll cover the generator. You take the western approach." As Marcus moved through a hidden passage beneath the house, he thought of how strange it felt to be fighting again after decades of peaceful farming. His old bones protested, but his mind was sharp. He emerged from a concealed hatch behind the storage shed just as two officers approached the main power unit. "Too predictable," Marcus whispered, raising a non-lethal stunner. Both officers dropped before they knew what hit them. On the other side of the property, Elijah moved through the tall crops, staying low. 3 officers were advancing toward the house, weapons drawn. With practiced movements, Elijah disabled the first 2, but the third managed to fire a shot that grazed his shoulder. "We have resistance," the officer shouted into his communicator before Elijah knocked him unconscious. Inside the command center, Brandt was growing increasingly frustrated. "What's happening out there?" "Report." Static answered him. Then a calm voice came through his communicator, but not from any of his officers. "The governor is working with StarCorp," Elijah's voice stated clearly. "You're part of an illegal operation to force farmers out on 6 colonies. We have all the evidence." Brandt's face paled. "Who is this?" "Identify yourself." "You know who I am," Elijah replied. "What you don't know is what I do. Galactic Intelligence has been watching colonial security for months." This was a bluff. Elijah's mission had nothing to do with colonial security, but Brandt didn't know that. As the standoff continued, something unexpected happened. Lights appeared on the horizon. Vehicles approaching, but not colonial security reinforcements. Farmers, settlers from nearby communities. People began to gather at the edge of the property. A woman named Lena stepped forward, leading about 30 armed settlers. She called out to the remaining officers, "We've watched long enough. This ends today." Marcus emerged from his position, surprised at the sight. He recognized many of the faces, people he had supplied with food when StarCorp cut their rations, families who had lost their farms to suspicious accidents. "We called for help," Lena explained when she reached Marcus. "No one listened. Until now." The crowd grew larger as more vehicles arrived. Colonial security officers found themselves surrounded by the very people they had been oppressing. Elijah rejoined his father, applying a quick medical patch to his shoulder wound. "This wasn't part of the plan," Marcus said, looking at the gathering crowd. "Best plans adapt," Elijah replied. He activated a small device from his pocket, an emergency beacon that would send a priority signal to galactic intelligence. "They'll listen today." By nightfall, the standoff had transformed. What began as a raid on one stubborn farmer had become a full colony uprising. People shared stories of StarCorp's abuses, of bribes paid to officials, of forced relocations. Under the stars of Epsilon 6, Marcus sat with his son on the porch of the farmhouse. Behind them, the crowd had set up camp in the fields, hundreds of lights glowing like earthbound stars. "You know there's no going back from this," Marcus said quietly. Elijah nodded. "Sometimes moving forward is the only option." "Your mother would have been proud," Marcus added. "She always said you had her fire." "And your stubbornness," Elijah replied with a small smile. In the distance, colonial security had retreated to the edge of the farm property, uncertain how to proceed against such numbers. The night was quiet except for the sound of people talking, planning, hoping. "What happens tomorrow?" Marcus asked. Elijah looked up at the sky, where his emergency signal was racing toward Galactic Intelligence Headquarters. "Justice, if we're lucky. Change, whether we're lucky or not." The dawn sky over Epsilon 6 erupted with light as two galactic intelligence ships broke atmosphere. Their sleek black hulls reflected the morning sun as they descended toward the Williams farm. The people who had camped overnight in the fields looked up in awe and uncertainty. "Is this good or bad?" Lena asked, standing beside Marcus. "Good," Elijah assured her, his eyes tracking the ship's approach. "Very good." The ships landed at the edge of the property, their engines powering down with a low hum. Colonial security officers, who had maintained their position overnight, suddenly looked nervous. Officer Brandt was frantically speaking into his communicator. A dozen agents in gray uniforms emerged from the ships, led by a tall woman with short silver hair. "Commander Vega." She walked directly to Elijah, ignoring the colonial officers attempting to intercept her. "Agent Williams," she said formally. "Your emergency signal indicated a Code Black situation." "Code Black confirmed, Commander." Elijah handed her the data drive his father had given him. Evidence of corruption reaching to the governor's office, illegal mining operations, forced displacements, and systemic harassment. Vega took the drive, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharp. "Enough to act on." "More than enough." She nodded once, then turned to address the gathered settlers. "I am Commander Vega of the Galactic Intelligence Service. This is now an official investigation. Any colonial security personnel who interfere will be detained." The effect was immediate. Most colonial officers retreated to their vehicles. Only Brandt remained, his face a mask of anger and fear. "You have no jurisdiction here," he protested. "This is a colonial matter. Human rights violations are a galactic matter," Vega replied coldly. She nodded to her agents, who moved to secure the area. By noon, the colony's governor was being escorted in restraints to one of the intelligence ships. StarCorp's local offices were sealed, their records confiscated. The evidence Marcus had collected for years exposed operations, not just on Epsilon 6, but across the sector. In the days that followed, more intelligence ships arrived. Temporary housing was set up for displaced farmers. The stellarium deposits were officially documented and placed under protection as a resource belonging to the colony as a whole, not any corporation. A week later, as workers began rebuilding damaged farms, Elijah received his new orders from Commander Vega. "They're offering me a promotion," he told his father as they stood in the replanted fields. The seedlings were just beginning to push through the soil tiny green promises of the future. "Senior operational status, my pick of assignments." Marcus nodded, his hands working the soil around a young plant. Important work. You've earned it. Elijah knelt beside his father, helping with the planting. So is this, he replied, looking at the land around them. The field stretched to the horizon, where other farmers were also rebuilding. I've requested permanent assignment to Epsilon Sector as Regional Security Director. The old man's eyes widened. You're staying. Someone needs to make sure it doesn't happen again. Elijah planted another seedling carefully. Besides, I've been away too long. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands stilling in the soil. Your mother always said you'd find your way back someday. She was usually right about these things. A small smile crossed Marcus's face. Always, not usually. They continued working as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the newly planted fields. In the distance, the temporary settlement buzzed with activity as people planned the new colony governance structure, one without StarCorp's influence. They're talking about elections, Marcus said. Some want me to run for the council. Will you? Maybe. Someone needs to speak for the farmers. He looked at his son. Unless you want to do it. Elijah laughed. One Williams in public service is enough. I prefer to work behind the scenes. As evening approached, they finished planting the last row of seedlings. The soil here contained the highest concentration of stellarium on the property, minerals that would now benefit the entire colony rather than lining corporate pockets. Standing together at the edge of the field, father and son looked out over the land that had nearly been taken from them. Your mother would be proud, Marcus said softly, his voice catching slightly. Of what you've become, of what you did here. Of both of us, Elijah replied, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. She always said the hardest thing wasn't fighting the battles, but building something worth fighting for. Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening in the fading light. She was right about that too. As darkness fell, lights came on in farmhouses across the valley, homes that had been abandoned now coming back to life. The stars appeared one by one above, reflecting in the rare blue minerals below. A perfect balance between heaven and earth, the past and the future, a legacy preserved and renewed.